I'm going to lead you towards programmatic assessment, but it's kind of a journey that I will take you on. And basically, it has also been my own personal journey. And I'll sketch, and here's the structure. I'll sketch the research that has been done in educational practice to arrive at certain, let's say, principles of assessment or messages that come through from the research. And then from the research, I'll go to the theory on programmatic assessment, and then I'll give an example. And then if there's time, I'll sketch some research that has been done with programmatic assessment. A disclaimer is in place. Most of the work and all the examples that I use come from the domain of medicine, because I've been very active in that domain. However, I think what I have to bring to the table is not specific to any domain. I think programmatic assessment can be applied in any particular content area. Let's start with our toolbox. I mean, we have a lot of different methods of assessment. It's really well filled. And we can classify it in a very simple model of competence. At the bottom level, you have knowledge, which you can assess with fact-oriented methods of assessment. Then we have knowing how, if you know how to apply your knowledge into concrete cases. And then you have the level of you're able to show, to demonstrate your performance, yet in a simulated situation. And ultimately, you have to be able to apply something in actual practice, which is the does level. And I think that we have developed all kinds of methods of assessment for each of these different layers of this competence pyramid, which is named Miller's competence pyramid. And we've been climbing that pyramid, and with each of these instruments, you can look at their characteristics, their quality characteristics. Validity, reliability, educational impact, acceptability, cost, etc. For the sake of ease and time, I'll stick to 3 of them. And I'll look at the evidence that we have and the messages that come from the research from each of these areas. Validity. Validity is what are we measuring? What do we want to measure? And of note is the fact that the educational change that we have gone through over time. Curricula have changed from an input orientation to an output orientation. An input orientation means so many hours of this discipline, so many weeks of this particular project, and so on and so forth. Whereas an output orientation, you define the outcomes of your education. What is it you want your learners to be able to do at the end of your training program? And therefore, we started to define either learning objectives or nowadays more competencies. What kind of skills would you like your graduates to have when they enter the labor market? And we went from teacher-oriented programs to learning-oriented, self-directed programs. And I think that one of the most fundamental problems in education is the issue of transfer. That is, that we think that if we pour in the knowledge in the student, that student it will be able to apply that knowledge when it's needed in professional situation. That is not the case. And that is why modern education programs really bring reality from the labor market into the education process all the time. And I heard you speak about projects and having assignments from the labor market into your educational programs. That is a smart strategy. So we've been defining those competencies, and let's look at an example from medicine. In the world, different medical programs have defined their outcomes, the skills that people need to be able to do. And here are 3 different systems, one from Canada, which has been adopted in the Netherlands. The middle one is from the States, and the third one from the UK. And there are many more. Interestingly, about these competencies frameworks is that they're very, very similar. And they have been built with a lot of stakeholder input, looking at what the labor market needed in terms of skills from a medical doctor. So another interesting point I find is that most of these skills are not related to the domain of medicine. We all have to communicate. We all have to work in a team. We all have to show professional behavior, right? So they're not really domain dependent. Some say and some speak about soft skills, so they're not so soft as you think. Some speak about 21st century skills. So these kind of skills are heavily emphasized. And there's a good reason for that, because we know from research that if things go wrong in the labor market, these kind of skills are involved. And vice versa is also true. If things go really well in the labor market, then these kind of skills are involved. And we also have research demonstrating that if there are problems with these kind of skills in the labor market, they could already have been spotted in the training program. So I think we have, therefore, an obligation to train and to assess these kind of skills. By the way, these kind of skills are not easy to define, right? They're complex skills. Try and define professionalism. Pretty tough, let alone that you can capture it in a checklist and assess your students with it. These kind of skills you don't learn in a single course. You don't have a course of a couple of weeks on communication and you'll be a good communicator for the rest of your life. These kind of skills are your longitudinal strands throughout the curriculum. And the curriculum caters these kind of skills and assesses these kind of skills regularly and longitudinally. Finally, these kind of skills cannot be assessed easily. They can only be assessed by using professional judgment, by direct observation. It's very hard to make a written test on communication. That's simply impossible. There will be a written course on karate. So they have to be demonstrated. They have to be shown and therefore observed, and that's to some extent subjective, but I'll come back to the issue of subjectivity much more. Let's look at some of the consistencies of the research and some of the messages. The messages from the validity research is that there's no magical bullet. There's no single method of assessment that can do it all. So in order to do a good job, you have to have a mixture of different methods to really spread and cover the competency pyramid as we just saw it. And we need both standardized and non-standardized assessment. And I think I skipped this slide to make the distinction between standardized and unstandardized assessment. The lower three layers of Miller's pyramid can be assessed with standardized assessment. For example, a multiple choice test or a standardized oral examination. Those are standardized assessments. If we're testing in actual practice, then we need to have unstandardized assessment because it needs to be adapted to that particular context. What we've learned is that we need both of them. We need both those standardized and non-standardized assessment methods. And what we've learned that if you have standardized assessment methods, you can improve the quality of what you're measuring by having quality control measures around test development. For example, peer reviewing test questions or test elements are really impactful. They have a lot of impact on the quality of your examinations. But if we talk about professional judgments and unstandardized assessment, the people are really important. because then you have to make your professional judgment and you have to give feedback to the learner. That's quite a skill that is needed from your teachers, and we'll discuss that much more later on. Let's move from validity to reliability. Now, what is reliability? If I were to measure your length twice, I would expect a high correlation between the first measure and the second measure. That is reliability. You can estimate reliability also with assessment methods, and I've done so in a bunch of studies. And we can compare the reliabilities of test formats. That's the next slide. Here we have a bunch of different methods of assessment: multiple choice, short essays, problem-solving tests, which are simulations on paper, a classic oral exam, a long case, which is also an oral exam, but then patient-based in medicine. An OSCE is a simulation of clinical skills in a simulated setting, and people move through different rooms and get clinical assignments and are directly observed in doing these assignments. A mini CEX is an observation in actual practice. So someone observes a student seeing a patient, and then feedback is being given. Video assessment, we have a video that we then have in a practice, and we sample encounters with patients and we score them. And finally, incognito standardized patients. These are really fake patients. We send these patients into doctors' practices, and the patients remain undetected. The doctor thinks there's a real patient, and the patient is trained to score the performance of the doctor. Basically, this is a coverage of Miller's pyramid from the bottom to the top. Here are reliability coefficients, and they say that for a test that has consequences, you need at least a reliability of 0.80. Now, if you look at this table, then you need quite a lot of testing time in order to come up with a reliability of 0.80. 3, 4 or more hours are needed to come up with a marginal reliability. So actually, in actual practice, you will make a lot of pass-fail decision errors simply because of unreliability in the test. Even with a reliability of 0.80, you will still make about 20% misclassifications in your pass-fail decisions. That is sizable. Or in other words, most of our assessments in actual practice are not very reliable, right? The remedy is to combine information, right? Be very careful with putting a lot of consequences to a single measure. Or yet in other words, one measure is no measure, right? This is bad news, and it has been found time and over again in a zillion studies. There's also good news in this slide, because you cannot say that very objective forms of assessment, like for example, the multiple choice test, is significantly more reliable than a more subjective test, like the oral exam or like the video assessment. The video assessment and the mini CEX and the oral exam are all very subjective. However, if you gather many subjective judgments, the reliability will be good. So it all depends on the sampling, right? So reliability is a matter of sampling. And this is good news, because if we wish to assess those complex skills that we were talking about, then we need to rely on professional judgment. And we can do so provided that we sample broadly. So basically the message is, Acceptable reliability is only achieved with very large samples. And no method is inherently better than any other method. And finally, objectivity is not the same as reliability, right? Many subjective judgments may provide a pretty robust picture, and that is good news. Right, so we've discussed validity, we discussed reliability. Let's move to the educational impact of our assessments. And naturally, they always say assessment drives learning. For the students, the assessments and the exams is the curriculum, right? But the relationship is more complex. Actually, the impact is often very negative. Typically what we do is we give students grades, right? Well, actually, grades is one of the poorest form of feedback you can get. If you were to grade me in this webinar, and you would give me a 7 on the Dutch 10-point scale, fine, thank you very much. But what should I do next? The grade itself carries no information whatsoever, right? And this is particularly a problem if we talk about these complex skills, right? These complex skills require feedback. Otherwise, they won't develop. I'm a PhD supervisor. I've had many, many PhD students. Imagine that a PhD student would send me a draft paper for an article, and I would give him back a grade. First of all, it's degrading, but secondly, that PhD student wouldn't know what to do because there's no information. And I think that we see in the Netherlands or anywhere else, this is very international, a great culture. People hunting for grades, a lot of competitiveness. And I see a lot of reductionism. I see very little feedback in our educational assessment practices. So there's non-alignment, what Winek was talking about. So the goals of the education are different from the actual goals of the assessment. And if there's misalignment, the assessment system always wins. I see a lot of tick box exercises. I won't bother with that with you because that's primarily in medicine where I've seen that a lot. But a lot of reductionism. And I think that the message here is kind of this. This is our education, most common educational practice. We have a piece of education, we have a test at the end, and learners move on to the next hurdle. Not sure if you're familiar with the forget curves in psychology, but if you learn something only for the occasion, a lot of that information has been lost within a few weeks. So the message really is, in my view, there should be no assessment without meaningful feedback. And we have learned that narrative feedback has a lot more impact in terms of feedback than scores have or grades have. And this is particularly true for complex skills. And then we have learned that the provision of feedback is no guarantee for the use of feedback. Feedback is essentially a dialogue between the feedback giver and the student. And I think that in terms of the learning impact from assessment, we need more longitudinal assessment. Most of our assessment is very modular, but I think that we need to create more longitudinal assessment to follow up on our learners. Let me have a drink first. Right, so these are some of the messages that come from the research on assessment. Let's move on to programmatic assessment into some theory. I mean, the implications are clear. The validity research says we need a multitude of methods. Reliability says you need a lot of sampling. And the learning impact research says we need more meaningful information in the assessment system. And that is the basis of programmatic assessment. In programmatic assessment, there are some building blocks or some principles that we try to adhere to. First one is that every assessment that is done is considered to be only one data point. No more than that. There's this little triangle, which is Miller's pyramid. It can be any method, right? And actually, I'm really agnostic in terms of method of assessment, but any method may do. It all depends on your educational justification for using that method at that point in time. And oftentimes the learning task, for example, designing something, can at the same time be the assessment task in order to evaluate, for example, the product of that design. So any assessment is but one data point, but important, every data point provides feedback. And every individual data point doesn't pass or fail. We take away the pass-fail decision from the individual data point. Why? Because the individual data point is fraught with unreliability. It doesn't tell you very much, right? It is but one data point. But it's information rich, could be quantitative, could be qualitative information, doesn't really matter. It should be meaningful for the learning, and there should be variation in format. If you would design a program of assessment, it would have your learners write over here, defend over there, present over there, and so on and so forth. It would have variation. And then we don't talk about summative or formative assessment. We talk about what is at stake, and that is a continuum. The individual data point is focused on giving feedback. So that is a low stake assessment, right? And if you have to take a high stake decision, then the number of data points you need is proportionally related to the stake of the decision. Let me put that more clearly into a graph. An individual data point, an individual method of assessment, an individual point of feedback is focused on feedback. It's not decision oriented, therefore is low stake. It's not of no stake because it may be used later on in the high stake decision making. Somewhere along the line, in our case, it's halfway through the year, we take a mid-stake decision by looking at the progress of the individual students, and we have a session with them, and we look where they are, where they stand, what needs attention, what needs remediation, and that's a mid-stake decision. And then at the end of the year, we have a high-stake decision. For example, promotion to the next year. And this is pass-fail, right? But now we have a lot of data points, right? So we have the full picture, really, and we can take that decision. By the way, when we do that, we then give the students their ECTS points. So in our case, at the end of the year, you get all your ECTS points, 60 ECTS points for the whole year. Not with every individual assessment. Right, basically what we do is a metaphor of the assessment information as pixels in a photograph. If you have a single pixel, you don't see a lot. If you have multiple pixels, slowly an image will start to occur. And when you have sufficient pixels, then you can take a decision, not before that. Typically in programmatic assessment, we do aggregate differently. This is a classical approach to aggregation where we have a single method of assessment and we calculate the total score. That's how we aggregate. And then we have problems in terms of combining different methods of assessment, like was said before in the introduction. In programmatic assessment, we use the information from different methods to aggregate to a single skill, right? So suppose one of your competencies would be academic skills, then you could aggregate information on tasks that require you to study the literature or write a literature review with tasks that are related to the same competency on, I don't know, making a presentation, right? So you aggregate information from different methods to the same skill. And here's where your competency framework is really important, which is your backbone really of the whole assessment system. Okay, now this is still pretty theoretical, and I'll take you to educational practice back again. And in the meantime, there are many programs that have adopted programmatic assessment, both nationally as well as internationally. And but I stay close to home. I will talk about our graduate entry program of medicine. This is a 4-year medical program. Normally, medical training programs are 6 years, but this is a 4-year program where students come in with a bachelor degree. And then they have 4 years time to become a medical doctor. Plus, on top of that, they get a Master of Science in research. And so it's strongly research oriented as well. Naturally, Maastricht University uses problem-based learning, PBL. That is used throughout the whole university. And also this program is done through PBL. We have these CANMETS competencies that we use. Actually, that is defined by law in the Netherlands. And actually, we also have high expectations of our students in terms of motivation, promotion of excellence, and self-directedness. The program, the assessment program, is divided into modular elements. So that could be assignments, that could be a multiple choice exam, that could be multiple short written testing across the period, across the block. So this is pretty normal, pretty standardized, but we also have a lot of longitudinal assessments where we have assessment of professional behavior, which we monitor longitudinally. Peer assessments are used oftentimes. We have, in the knowledge domain, we have so-called progress tests. That is that we have a sort of a final examination, which is a multiple choice test, a comprehensive multiple choice test, which we administer to all the students in the curriculum. In this case, all 4 years sit the same test at the same time. We repeat this 4 times a year. And then we look at the progress of our students, right? And they can monitor their progress. And I'll show you an example of a feedback report on progress testing. Very important, all the assessment is informative and low stake. The portfolio, the electronic portfolio, is the central instrument. Everything is gathered within a central portfolio. Important to mention is also, there's an overview of this. Important to mention is these are the modules, these are the progress tests, these are the longitudinal assessments. Important to say is that every student also gets a mentor. We call them counselors. I hate that term. because counseling to me is something very different than mentoring or coaching. And the coach follows the student throughout the curriculum. In our case, all 4 years. The coach has access to the electronic portfolio of the student. They have regular meetings, which are prepared by the student. So the student analyzes his or her progress based on all the assessment data. That is being discussed with the coach, and certain actions are taken in terms of maybe remediation or paying attention to something different in the next module. So this is kind of the system. And then at the end of the year, we take the final decision over there. And I'll explain that a little bit more later on. We pay a lot of attention to feedback. Right? In this case, this is a report on the progress test. Remember the longitudinal written tests that we administer. And the students may log into a system and they may monitor their growth in any area. This is for their total scores, but you can, for example, show your growth in anatomy over time, or in all your basic sciences, or in any other clinical discipline. So basically, this is an X-ray of someone's knowledge base. Provides a lot of feedback to the students. The electronic portfolio can aggregate data points from different observations into something like a spider graph. So here you see the different spikes, which are the competencies as we have them, and you see the score of the individual and of the total cohort. So you can see where the strengths and limitations are with a particular learner. The number of the number in brackets and behind each competency is the number of data points that we have. We can monitor the performance longitudinally, right? We can click on any dot, and then you get the original information that was behind it, both quantitative and qualitative. A very important function in the electronic portfolio is the generate me all the narrative feedback on this particular learner. And then it will give you all the narrative information that is in there. This can be filtered by competency, for example. So you get a very quick overview of where the learner stands. And it's really very convenient to show the performance of what the student can do. By the way, there was would accreditation committees allow us to do this? Accreditation committees like portfolios like these, because you can demonstrate easily that your learners are up to par and have mastered certain competencies. So they're pretty happy with that. And then finally, not finally, importantly, the coaching is done by counselors. And I think it's absolutely essential in programmatic assessment. The coaching is enormously appreciated by both the coach and by the student. Usually, a teacher has about 10 students to mentor. We've been scaling up because the graduate entry program is a relatively small program, but we've been scaling up programmatic assessment to our 6-year medical curriculum. And that has an intake of 340 students per year. And we had to get and acquire many more counselors, many more mentors. And we found them, but that was a daunting task, of course. But very importantly, I mean, this is really the basis of self-directed learning, having a dialogue with a trusted other person. Decision-making, the high-stake decision-making, is done in a committee of examiners. They look at the portfolios and they come to a judgment. When the committee has consensus on passing or failing, actually in real practice, it's passing, failing, or distinction. This is to give information to a potential cum laude. But it's done in a committee. It's based on consensus. Now you might say, isn't that a lot of work? No, it's not. Because for 95% of the cases, 95% of the students, this is a no-brain decision, right? So you don't use that time for no-brain decisions. The committee will deliberate, particularly if there's something to deliberate, right? So if you have to take a harsh decision or it's not entirely clear, the committee will deliberate and will then come to a consensus decision. Okay, not going into this, time is running out. We've been implementing programmatic assessment further and further. Won't bother you with that. We have 10 minutes left. Very, very quickly, if you Google my name, you come to my personal homepage and you'll find lots of publications. And here's an interesting one that has just been published at the end of last year, which is the first literature review on programmatic assessment, in this case, in the healthcare professions. But go to my homepage and you'll find the PDFs there. Very quickly, implementation of programmatic assessment is your biggest challenge because it's a totally different vision on assessment and you need to convince a lot of people. I think I'm going to leave it with that. I think that my conclusion is that we should stop thinking in terms of individual methods and think more systematically and use a programmatic approach that is more longitudinally oriented, in which every assessment may be functional and in which professional judgment, whether that's from a teacher or a fellow student, is imperative. And we deal with subjectivity through sampling. And I think that this approach of programmatic assessment both optimizes the learning function and optimizes the pass-fail decision-making function of assessment. And that, to me, is an integrated whole and ends my journey with you. And I'm open to questions. There must be many.